Dust devils danced across the cracked earth, mocking the parched landscape. The relentless sun beat down, turning the Texas plains into a furnace. Rivers that once flowed freely were now dry beds, choked with sand and withered weeds. The drought had been unforgiving, stretching on for months, and its grip tightened with each passing day. Both the Comanche and the white settlers knew its sting. For the Comanche, the drought meant dwindling herds of buffalo, their primary source of food, clothing, and shelter. Hunting parties returned empty-handed, their faces etched with worry. The elders spoke of lean times, of hardships their people had faced before, but this drought felt different, more malevolent. The white settlers fared little better. Their crops withered in the fields, their cattle grew thin and weak, and the wells ran dry. They prayed for rain, their eyes constantly scanning the cloudless sky for any sign of relief. Tensions rose as resources dwindled, and suspicion grew between neighbors. Amidst this hardship, life stubbornly persisted. Lone Wolf, a respected warrior of the Comanche, found his world irrevocably changed. His beloved wife, Morning Star, succumbed to a fever, leaving him alone with their newborn twin sons. He named them Little Hawk and Swift Arrow, praying they would grow to be strong and brave warriors. But as the drought intensified, Lone Wolf faced a challenge greater than any he had ever encountered. How could he possibly provide for his sons when the land itself seemed determined to starve them? He cradled them, listening to their weak cries, the cries of hunger he was helpless to answer. The drought was not merely a hardship. It was a death sentence for his children if he could not find milk. The loss of Morning Star had been a blow that nearly shattered Lone Wolf. She had been his sun, his moon, his guiding star. They had grown up together, their bond as strong as the ancient oaks that dotted the plains. He remembered her laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, the quiet strength she possessed. Now, only silence remained where her voice had been. He tried to honor her memory by caring for their sons as best he could. He wrapped them in soft buckskin, sang them the lullabies Morning Star used to sing, and held them close to his chest, hoping to impart some of his strength to their tiny bodies. But his efforts were not enough. The twins grew weaker each day, their cries becoming more feeble. Lone Wolf was a warrior, skilled in battle, accustomed to hardship. He knew how to track a deer, how to fight an enemy, how to survive in the wilderness. But he knew nothing about caring for infants, especially without the support of a woman. The other women in his tribe offered what help they could, but they too were struggling to feed their own families during the drought. Goat's milk was scarce, and what little they had was reserved for the older children. He watched his sons, their small faces gaunt, their eyes dull with hunger. Despair began to creep into his heart. He had faced death many times, but the thought of losing his sons was unbearable. He would do anything, sacrifice anything, to save them. The pride of a warrior, the traditions of his tribe, all seemed insignificant in the face of his children's suffering. He knew he had to find a way to get them milk, even if it meant venturing into the unknown and asking for help from those he had been taught to distrust. He would swallow his pride for his sons. The days bled into one another, each sunrise bringing a renewed sense of desperation. Lone Wolf tried everything he could think of. He crushed berries into a pulp, hoping the juice would provide some nourishment, but the twins refused to swallow it, turning their heads away and crying weakly. He hunted tirelessly, but the game was scarce, and the few rabbits he managed to catch offered little sustenance. He watched the other children in the tribe, their bellies round with goat's milk, their eyes bright and full of life. A pang of envy shot through him, quickly followed by shame. He shouldn't begrudge them their good fortune, but the sight of their health only served to highlight his own failure. The elders of the tribe, seeing his struggle, offered words of encouragement and advice. "Be patient, Lone Wolf," they said. "The drought will pass. The Great Spirit will provide." But Lone Wolf's patience was wearing thin. He couldn't wait for the Great Spirit to act. His sons needed help now. He considered leaving the tribe, venturing further afield in search of food. But he knew that traveling with 2 infants would be incredibly dangerous, especially during the drought. They would be vulnerable to predators to the elements, and to starvation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Lone Wolf sat by the fire, cradling his sons. Their cries were weaker now, almost silent. He knew he was running out of time. He closed his eyes and prayed to the Great Spirit, begging for guidance. When he opened them, he saw a flicker of light in the distance, a light that seemed to beckon him. It was the light of the white settlers' settlement, a place he had always been taught to avoid. But now, it seemed like the only hope he had left. He made his decision. He would go to the settlement and beg for milk. It was a desperate gamble, but he was willing to risk everything for his sons. The journey to the settlement was fraught with peril. Lone Wolf traveled under the cover of darkness, his senses on high alert. He knew that venturing into white territory was a dangerous act, one that could easily lead to confrontation or even death. The Comanche and the settlers had a long and troubled history, marked by conflict and mistrust. He carried the twins in a makeshift cradleboard slung across his back, their weak cries muffled by the buckskin. He walked for hours, his muscles aching, his throat parched. The landscape was desolate, the silence broken only by the occasional howl of a coyote. As he neared the settlement, he could see the faint glow of lanterns flickering in the distance. He paused, taking a deep breath to steel his nerves. He knew that he was about to cross a line, to break a taboo. But he had no choice. His sons' lives depended on it. He approached the settlement cautiously, staying in the shadows, observing the layout of the buildings and the movements of the people. He saw men with rifles patrolling the perimeter, their faces grim and watchful. He saw women tending to gardens and children playing in the dusty streets. It was a world so different from his own, a world he had always viewed with suspicion and hostility. He knew that he couldn't simply walk into the settlement and demand help. He had to find a way to approach them, to appeal to their humanity. He decided to wait until morning, hoping to find someone who might be willing to listen to his plea. He found a secluded spot near the edge of the settlement, concealed by a thicket of mesquite trees, and settled in for the night, praying that his sons would survive until dawn. He knew that this was his last chance, his last hope. He would beg. He would plead. He would do whatever it took to save his children. Dawn broke, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and gold. Lone Wolf emerged from the thicket, his eyes scanning the settlement. He needed to find someone who might be sympathetic to his plight. He saw a woman drawing water from a well, her movements slow and deliberate. He noticed the sadness in her eyes, a weariness that mirrored his own. He hesitated, unsure of how to approach her. He knew that his appearance alone might frighten her. He was a Comanche warrior, dressed in buckskin, his face painted with tribal markings. He was everything she had been taught to fear. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the shadows. "Woman," he said, his voice low and raspy. The woman turned, startled. Her eyes widened in fear as she took in his appearance. She clutched the water bucket tightly, her knuckles white. "Please," Lone Wolf said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I mean you no harm." He took a step closer, and the twins, sensing his movement, began to cry. The woman's eyes darted to the cradleboard on his back. Her expression softened slightly as she heard the baby's cries. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My sons," Lone Wolf said, his voice thick with emotion. "They are hungry. They need milk." He swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak the words that threatened to choke him. "I beg you, woman, help me." He lowered himself to his knees, a Comanche warrior humbling himself before a white woman. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, but he would do anything for his sons. "My sons are dying." Sarah stared at the Comanche warrior kneeling before her, his plea echoing in the morning air. Fear warred with a strange sense of empathy within her. She recognized the desperation in his eyes, the same desperation she had felt just weeks ago when her own baby, Thomas, had been taken by a sudden fever. The milk still came, a painful reminder of the child she had lost. She looked at the cradleboard on his back, at the tiny faces peeking out from beneath the buckskin. Twins. Her heart ached. She knew what it was like to lose a child, but to imagine losing two. The other settlers were beginning to stir, drawn by the commotion. Sarah knew that she had to make a decision quickly. Helping this Comanche could bring trouble, danger, even violence to her community. But turning him away, condemning his sons to death, was unthinkable. She took a deep breath and made her choice. "Get up," she said, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. "Get up and follow me." Lone Wolf looked up at her, his eyes filled with surprise and hope. He rose to his feet, his movements stiff and awkward. He followed Sarah as she led him to a small, secluded shed behind her house. Inside, she gestured for him to sit. She disappeared into her house and returned with a bowl and a clean cloth. "I have milk," she said, her voice soft, "but I can't give it to you here. Someone might see us." She paused, her eyes searching his. "Meet me at the creek tomorrow morning before sunrise. Bring your sons. I will feed them there." Lone Wolf nodded, his heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You are a good woman." He knew that he was placing his trust in a stranger, but he had no other choice. He would meet her at the creek. He would do whatever it took to save his sons. He would be there. The next morning, long before the sun peaked over the horizon, Sarah slipped out of her house. The settlement was still asleep, shrouded in a blanket of pre-dawn quiet. She carried a small pail filled with fresh milk, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that what she was doing was dangerous, that if she were caught, she would face the wrath of her community. But she couldn't turn back. The image of those two starving babies haunted her. She reached the creek and waited, her eyes scanning the darkness. Soon, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows. Lone Wolf. He carried the twins, their cries faint but audible. As Lone Wolf approached, Sarah knelt by the creek, dipping the cloth into the milk. She gently offered it to Little Hawk, who latched onto it greedily, sucking with all his might. Swift Arrow followed, his tiny mouth working eagerly. Sarah watched them, her heart swelling with emotion. It had been so long since she had held a baby, since she had felt that connection, that sense of purpose. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. Lone Wolf watched Sarah, his face unreadable. He saw the tears in her eyes, the tenderness in her touch. He knew that she was more than just a kind woman. She was a mother at heart. For the next few weeks, Sarah and Lone Wolf met at the creek every morning before sunrise. Sarah fed the twins, and Lone Wolf watched over them, his gratitude growing with each passing day. The babies grew stronger, their cries becoming more robust, their eyes brighter. Sarah's milk was saving them, and in saving them, she was saving herself. The act of caring for these babies was filling a void in her heart, a void left by the loss of her own child. A bond was forming, a bond that transcended language, culture, and fear. It was the bond of a mother and her children, a bond that nothing could break. The secret meetings at the creek became a sacred ritual. Sarah would arrive first, her pail of milk swinging gently, her heart filled with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Lone Wolf would appear moments later, emerging from the shadows with the twins nestled securely in their cradleboard. Sarah learned to recognize the subtle differences between the babies. Little Hawk was the more adventurous one, always eager to explore the world around him. Swift Arrow was more cautious, preferring to stay close to his brother and his father. She marveled at their tiny hands, their delicate features, their innocent eyes. Lone Wolf, in turn, began to see Sarah in a new light. He had always viewed white people with suspicion and distrust, but Sarah was different. She was kind, compassionate, and selfless. She had risked everything to help him and his sons. He admired her strength, her courage, and her unwavering dedication. He started bringing her small gifts, a smooth, gray stone he had found by the river, a feather from a hawk, a handful of wildflowers. They were simple tokens of his appreciation, but they spoke volumes. They didn't speak much, their communication limited by the language barrier. But they didn't need words. Their eyes spoke volumes. Their gestures conveyed their feelings. They understood each other on a deeper level, a level that transcended language and culture. One morning, as Sarah was feeding the twins, Lone Wolf reached out and gently touched her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with warmth and tenderness. In that moment, they both knew that their bond had deepened, that their relationship had become something more than just a simple act of kindness. It was the beginning of something special, something unexpected, something that could change their lives forever. It was love. Their secret was bound to be discovered. In a small settlement, secrets rarely stayed buried for long. Martha, a busybody known for her sharp eyes and even sharper tongue, had noticed Sarah's early morning excursions. She saw Sarah sneaking out of her house with a pail and returning empty-handed. Suspicious, Martha decided to follow her. One morning, she hid behind a cluster of bushes near the creek and watched as Sarah met with a Comanche warrior. Her eyes widened in shock and horror as she saw Sarah feeding the babies. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. A white woman helping a Comanche, feeding his children? It was an act of treason, a betrayal of everything she believed in. Martha wasted no time in spreading the news. By midday, the entire settlement was buzzing with the story of Sarah and the Comanche. The reactions were swift and harsh. Fear, anger, and outrage swept through the community. "She's consorting with the enemy," some shouted. "She's putting us all in danger," others cried. The men gathered at the saloon, their faces grim, their voices filled with hostility. They decided that something had to be done. They couldn't allow Sarah to continue her secret meetings. It was too risky, too dangerous. They confronted Sarah that evening, gathering in front of her house, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches. Sarah, their leader, a stern-faced man named Jedediah, said, his voice booming, "We know what you've been doing. We know about the Comanche." Sarah stood on her porch, her chin held high, her eyes filled with defiance. She knew that this moment was inevitable. She had known from the beginning that her actions would have consequences, but she was prepared to face them. She had done what she believed was right. She had saved 2 innocent lives, and she wouldn't apologize for it. "I was helping children," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Children who were starving." "They're Comanche," Jedediah retorted. "They're savages. They're not our responsibility." "They're still children," Sarah replied, "and they needed my help." She would stand her ground. "It's not that simple, Sarah," Jedediah said, his voice softening slightly. "We're not saying you're a bad person, but you have to understand these are dangerous times. We can't afford to be seen as weak. The Comanche are our enemies. We have to protect ourselves." "Protect ourselves from babies?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Is that what we've come to? Are we so afraid that we're going to attack innocent children?" "It's not just about the babies," another man chimed in. "It's about Lone Wolf. What if he's using you? What if he's gathering information about our settlement? What if he's planning an attack?" Sarah shook her head. "Lone Wolf would never do that," she said, her voice firm. "He's a good man. He's a father who's desperate to save his children." "You can't be sure of that, Sarah," Jedediah said. "You can't trust him. He's a Comanche. They're all the same." "They're not all the same," Sarah insisted. "Just like we're not all the same. There are good people and bad people in every group, and Lone Wolf is one of the good ones." The argument continued late into the night, with neither side willing to back down. Finally, Jedediah issued an ultimatum. "Sarah," he said, his voice stern, "we're giving you one chance. Stop helping the Comanche. Stop meeting with Lone Wolf. If you don't, you'll have to leave the settlement." Sarah stood on her porch, her face pale but resolute. She looked at the faces of her neighbors, the people she had known her whole life. She saw fear, anger, and mistrust. But she also saw a flicker of understanding, a hint of compassion. She knew that they were scared, that they were acting out of fear. But she couldn't abandon Lone Wolf and his sons. She couldn't turn her back on what she knew was right. "I can't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't stop helping them." The crowd gasped. Jedediah shook his head in disappointment. "Then you leave us no choice, Sarah," he said. You have until morning to pack your things. Then you have to leave." Sarah was banished. News of Lone Wolf's secret dealings with the white settlers eventually reached his own tribe. At first, there were whispers, hushed conversations held around the flickering campfires. Some dismissed it as rumors, tall tales spun by jealous warriors. But as the truth became undeniable, the whispers turned to murmurs of discontent. Many in the tribe saw Lone Wolf's actions as a sign of weakness. A Comanche warrior was supposed to be strong, self-reliant, and independent. He was not supposed to rely on the charity of his enemies. They questioned his loyalty, wondering if he had forgotten his heritage, if he had betrayed his people. The tribal elders summoned Lone Wolf to a council meeting. The air was thick with tension as he stood before them, his face stoic, his heart heavy. Chief Black Kettle, a wise and respected leader, spoke first. "Lone Wolf," he said, his voice grave, "we have heard disturbing reports. Reports that you have been seeking help from the white settlers." Lone Wolf remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ground. He knew that he had broken a sacred taboo, that he had risked the respect of his tribe. "Is this true?" Chief Black Kettle pressed, his voice growing sterner. "Have you been consorting with our enemies?" Lone Wolf raised his head, his eyes meeting the chief's gaze. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "My sons were starving. I had no other choice." "A Comanche warrior always has a choice," another elder interjected, his voice filled with scorn. "You could have hunted. You could have raided. You could have died with honor." "Died with honor?" Lone Wolf retorted, his voice rising in anger. "Is that what you wanted? For my sons to die with me? Is that what it means to be a Comanche?" He paused, taking a deep breath to regain his composure. "I chose life," he said, his voice softening. "I chose to save my sons, and I would do it again." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. They understood Lone Wolf's desperation, his love for his children. But they couldn't ignore the fact that he had broken their sacred laws. They needed to decide what to do with him. His actions could bring shame and dishonor to the entire tribe. The decision was a heavy one. The next morning, Sarah packed her few belongings into a small wagon. She looked around her house, her heart aching with sadness. She had built a life here, a life that was now being torn apart. But she knew that she couldn't stay. She couldn't live in a place where she was seen as an outcast, a traitor. As she drove away from the settlement, she saw Lone Wolf waiting for her at the edge of the creek. He stood there, his face etched with worry, the twins nestled securely in their cradleboard. Sarah stopped the wagon and climbed down, her eyes meeting Lone Wolf's. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They banished me from the settlement." Lone Wolf nodded, his expression grim. He had already heard the news. The tribal elders had told him that he was forbidden from seeing Sarah again. They had warned him that if he continued to consort with her, he would face severe consequences. "What will you do?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. "I don't know," Lone Wolf admitted, his voice heavy with despair. "My tribe want me to stay away from you, but I can't abandon my sons. They need your milk." Sarah and Lone Wolf stood there for a long moment, their eyes locked in a silent conversation. They both knew that they faced an impossible choice. They could obey their communities, sacrificing their own happiness and the well-being of the twins. Or they could defy their communities, risking everything for the sake of their love and their shared commitment to the babies. "I can't leave you," Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I can't abandon the twins. They're like my own children. And I can't ask you to sacrifice everything for me," Lone Wolf replied, his voice filled with anguish. "You deserve a better life than this." But they both knew that their hearts had already made the decision. They were bound together by a force stronger than fear, stronger than prejudice, stronger than the disapproval of their communities. They would find a way to be together, to raise the twins, to build a life for themselves, no matter the cost. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together. They were in this together. As Sarah and Lone Wolf discussed their uncertain future, a new threat emerged, eclipsing their personal struggles. A band of Kiowa warriors, known for their ruthlessness and their hatred of both the Comanche and the white settlers, was on the warpath. Driven by hunger and desperation, they planned to raid both the settlement and Lone Wolf's tribe, stealing their food, their livestock, and their supplies. A young Comanche scout, loyal to Lone Wolf despite the tribe's disapproval, brought word of the impending attack. He warned Lone Wolf that the Kiowa were planning to strike at dawn, catching both communities off guard. Lone Wolf knew that he had to act quickly. He couldn't stand by and watch as the Kiowa slaughtered innocent people. But he also knew that he couldn't warn both communities without risking further alienation from his tribe and further endangering Sarah. He decided to confide in Sarah, telling her everything he knew about the impending raid. He trusted her implicitly, knowing that she would do whatever it took to protect the settlement. Sarah, in turn, knew that she had to warn her former neighbors. Despite their harsh treatment of her, she couldn't let them be slaughtered by the Kiowa. She saddled her horse and rode towards the settlement, her heart pounding with fear. She arrived just before dawn, bursting into the saloon where the men were gathered, their faces grim and weary. "The Kiowa are coming," she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "They're planning to attack at dawn." At first, the men were skeptical. They didn't trust Sarah, seeing her as a traitor. But as she described the Kiowa's plans in detail, they began to realize that she was telling the truth. Jedediah, despite his reservations, recognized the urgency of the situation. He rallied the men, preparing them for battle. They barricaded the doors and windows, gathered their weapons, and waited for the Kiowa to arrive. Meanwhile, Lone Wolf raced back to his tribe, warning them of the impending attack. The Comanche warriors, despite their doubts about Lone Wolf's loyalty, prepared to defend their families. As the sun began to rise, the Kiowa attacked, unleashing a torrent of arrows and gunfire. Both the settlement and the Comanche village were plunged into chaos. The battle had begun. Now Sarah and Lone Wolf would have to choose sides. Or would they? Could they somehow find a way to fight together, to protect both communities from a common enemy? The battle raged, a chaotic mix of gunfire, arrows, and war cries. Sarah, armed with a rifle she had learned to use from her father, fought alongside the settlers, helping to defend the settlement from the Kiowa onslaught. She moved quickly and efficiently, reloading her rifle with practiced ease, taking aim at the Kiowa warriors who dared to approach the barricades. Lone Wolf, leading a group of Comanche warriors, attacked the Kiowa from the rear, disrupting their assault on the settlement. He fought with fierce determination, his tomahawk flashing in the sunlight, his war cry echoing across the plains. He was a whirlwind of fury, cutting down the Kiowa warriors who stood in his path. Sarah and Lone Wolf, fighting on separate fronts, were united in their determination to protect both communities. They knew that if the Kiowa succeeded, both the settlement and the Comanche village would be destroyed. As the battle wore on, the Kiowa began to falter. They had not expected such fierce resistance from both the settlers and the Comanche. Their attack lost momentum, and they began to retreat. Sarah saw a group of Kiowa warriors attempting to flank the settlement, trying to break through the defenses. She raced towards them, firing her rifle as she ran. She managed to take down several of the Kiowa warriors, but she was soon surrounded. Just as she thought she was about to be overwhelmed, Lone Wolf appeared, charging into the midst of the Kiowa warriors, his tomahawk raised high. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, driving the Kiowa back, giving Sarah a chance to escape. Together, Sarah and Lone Wolf fought side by side, defending both communities from the Kiowa attack. They proved their loyalty to both the settlers and the Comanche, showing that it was possible to bridge the gap between two cultures, to overcome prejudice and hatred, to fight for a common cause. They fought for peace. They fought for their families. They fought for their future. They were victorious. The Kiowa retreated. The aftermath of the raid brought a sense of stunned silence. Both the settlement and the Comanche village were scarred by the battle, littered with debris and the bodies of the fallen. But amidst the destruction, something remarkable began to happen. The settlers, witnessing the bravery and skill of the Comanche warriors, started to see them in a new light. They realized that the Comanche were not just savages, as they had been taught to believe, but were also courageous and honorable people who were willing to fight to protect their families and their way of life. Similarly, the Comanche, witnessing Sarah's unwavering commitment to the settlement and her willingness to risk her life to defend them, began to question their own prejudices. They realized that not all white people were the same, that some were capable of kindness, compassion, and selflessness. Jedediah, humbled by Sarah's bravery and her loyalty to the settlement, approached her with a contrite heart. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with remorse, "we were wrong about you. You risked your life to save us. We owe you a debt of gratitude." He offered her a place back in the settlement, promising that she would be welcomed with open arms. He also extended an olive branch to Lone Wolf and his tribe, proposing a truce, a chance to build a lasting peace between the two communities. Chief Black Kettle, witnessing the settlers' change of heart, also recognized the opportunity for a new beginning. He agreed to meet with Jedediah to discuss the possibility of a peaceful coexistence. Sarah and Lone Wolf, standing side by side, watched as the two leaders shook hands, sealing their commitment to peace. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that it was possible to overcome prejudice and hatred to build a better future for their children, a future where two cultures could live together in harmony. They knew that Little Hawk and Swift Arrow would grow up in a world better than the one they had been born into. The shared humanity, so long denied, began to shine through. Despite the settlers' newfound acceptance and Jedediah's heartfelt invitation to return, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She knew that she could go back to her old life, to the familiar comforts of the settlement, to the safety and security of her community. But her heart no longer belonged there. She had come to realize that her love for Lone Wolf and the twins was stronger than any sense of loyalty to her former life. She had become a mother to Little Hawk and Swift Arrow, a part of their family. She couldn't imagine leaving them, couldn't imagine abandoning them to a life without her. She also knew that Lone Wolf needed her, that he couldn't raise the twins alone, that he needed her strength, her compassion, her love. She had seen the way he looked at her, the way his eyes lit up whenever she was near. She knew that their love was meant to be, that they were destined to be together. She approached Lone Wolf, her heart pounding with anticipation. "Lone Wolf," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I can't go back to the settlement. My place is with you, with the twins." Lone Wolf's eyes widened in surprise and joy. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice filled with tenderness. "It will not be easy. Life with the Comanche is hard." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice resolute. "But I'm not afraid of hard work. I'm not afraid of a different way of life. All I care about is being with you, being with the twins." Lone Wolf smiled, his eyes shining with love. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "Then welcome home," he whispered in her ear. Sarah knew that she was making a difficult choice, a choice that would forever alter the course of her life. But she also knew that it was the right choice, the only choice she could make. She was following her heart, embracing her destiny. She was leaving the settlement behind, embarking on a new adventure, a new life, a life filled with love, family, and purpose. She would go and be the mother those boys needed. She would be a Comanche wife. Life with the Comanche was a stark contrast to the life Sarah had known in the settlement. She traded her comfortable house for a simple teepee, her familiar clothes for buckskin garments, her structured days for the rhythms of the natural world. The Comanche women welcomed her into their fold, teaching her their ways, sharing their skills, and offering their support. They showed her how to tan hides, how to gather berries and roots, how to build a fire, how to survive in the harsh wilderness. At first, Sarah struggled to adapt. The language was difficult to learn, the customs were strange, and the work was physically demanding. But she persevered, driven by her love for Lone Wolf and the twins. She was determined to become a good Comanche wife, a good mother to Little Hawk and Swift Arrow. She quickly learned to love the nomadic lifestyle, the freedom of roaming the plains, the close connection to nature. She marveled at the beauty of the landscape, the vastness of the sky, the abundance of wildlife. She learned to respect the Comanche's deep reverence for the land, their sustainable way of life, their strong sense of community. She became a skilled hunter, a proficient horsewoman, a valuable member of the tribe. She earned the respect of the Comanche warriors, who admired her courage and her determination. Most importantly, she became the mother that Little Hawk and Swift Arrow needed. She nursed them, cared for them, taught them, and loved them as if they were her own. She sang them lullabies in English and Comanche, told them stories from both cultures, and instilled in them a sense of pride in their heritage. She bridged the gap between two worlds, blending her white culture with the Comanche culture, creating a unique and harmonious blend. She showed the Comanche that not all white people were their enemies, and she showed the settlers that the Comanche were not just savages. She was a symbol of hope, a beacon of light, a testament to the power of love and understanding. She had truly found her home. The drought eventually broke, the rains returned, and the land began to heal. The buffalo herds grew larger, the rivers flowed freely, and the crops thrived. The Comanche and the settlers, inspired by Sarah and Lone Wolf's example, worked together to rebuild their communities, sharing their resources and their knowledge. As a symbol of their newfound unity and their enduring love, Sarah and Lone Wolf decided to marry. They wanted a ceremony that would honor both their cultures, a celebration of their love and their commitment to each other and to their families. They invited both the settlers and the Comanche to the wedding, hoping to further strengthen the bonds between the two communities. Jedediah and Chief Black Kettle both attended, offering their blessings to the happy couple. The wedding was a beautiful and moving event, a fusion of Comanche and Western traditions. Sarah wore a buckskin dress adorned with intricate beadwork, a gift from the Comanche women. Lone Wolf wore his finest warrior attire, his face painted with tribal markings. The ceremony began with a Comanche ritual, a blessing from the tribal elders, a prayer for a long and happy marriage. Then, a traveling preacher, who had been invited by the settlers, performed a traditional Western ceremony, reciting vows and exchanging rings. As Sarah and Lone Wolf exchanged their vows, their eyes met, and they smiled, their hearts filled with love and gratitude. They had overcome so many obstacles, faced so much adversity, but they had emerged stronger, more resilient, more in love than ever before. Little Hawk and Swift Arrow, now healthy and thriving, stood by their side, witnessing their parents' union, their faces beaming with joy. They were a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of love and understanding, a promise of a better future. The wedding feast was a grand celebration, a mix of Comanche and Western cuisine, a joyful gathering of two cultures, united in peace and harmony. Sarah and Lone Wolf danced beneath the stars, their love shining bright, their future filled with hope. They had found their happily ever after, a love story for the ages, a tale of two worlds brought together by love.